Good evening, everyone. It is a joy to be with you this evening. I want to get started immediately with moving into this celebration on the eve of Juneteenth. The way that many of our communities are looking towards understanding our community, understanding our ancestors, and understanding our passions for moving into this special time of liberation and freedom, and the understanding of when the last vestiges of liberation were pronounced. In order to do that, I would like to have Tia put up a slide for us to meditate on for a moment. We're talking about this idea of freedom, and I want us to give honor to the notion that freedom, as much as we have written songs about it and poetry about it, that freedom is really not all that romantic on Juneteenth, as much as it has been regaled in the African American community and communities of color for so long. It is not a romantic holiday for which we're wistful and joyous. It's quite alarming to think that after being enslaved for so long, that all of a sudden with one announcement that you're free, what does that mean for tomorrow? And this gentleman is a photograph that was used by the abolitionists to talk about the treachery of slavery in a grotesque sort of way, to shape what it is that our bodies were wrangled and our spirits were wrangled and whipped and beaten, and yet there's still an air of strength and fortitude. I started with this slide because I want us to understand that, yes, freedom is not romantic, but more importantly, because this gentleman is an ancestor, and the wisdom of his image speaks to us. We don't have his words. We don't have anything much about him. We don't even know who, quote unquote, owned him or where he was, but we do know that he has a story to tell, and that story to tell is not a romantic one. But because he is an ancestor, the story that he tells us gives us the fuel to move forward in this journey we call life. When Paul Robeson did a play called Emperor Jones, he had a scene that he kept in the Broadway play that was cut out of the movie, in which there were drums in the jungle in Africa. And he reckoned that the drums were like voices of the ancestors speaking to one another. And as they spoke to one another, they told the stories that words could not tell. The rhythms told the languages and spoke the languages that people could not understand, but the rhythms gave honor to and spoke to the ancestors. So I would like to give honor to this gentleman by speaking to him in a language that is a language that comes from all of our hearts, which is one of rhythm. Tia, if we could move to the next slide, please. While freedom is not romantic, it can help us to boldly claim what is right and what is righteous. When I was playing that and I felt my fingers tripping over the forest as I was running away into freedom, thinking of Harriet Tubman and thinking of the notion of, oh, freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. I thought about the ancestors that have graced our shores and knew that they deserved libation and honor. And so, to the north, wherever our ancestors are, guiding us and leading us towards freedom, towards liberation, and towards the path of justice and righteousness. To you, I pour libations and thank you for your wisdom and your honor. Ancestors to the south, you upon whose shoulders we stand and who bore the burdens of yesteryear with dignity and with strength, claiming a new way to be family, a new way to be life, a new way to be love. We give you honor and pour out the libations of this earth to call your spirits here with us today. To this we pour to you. O great ancestors who are lurking about in the West, you who are bringing your Eastern sensibilities upward into the sky to show us the direction that we need to go from back home. We give you honor because your spirit's journey travels far and leads us back homeward, homeward, homeward. You bring us over the sunrise to the sunset, and we raise this libation to you. Because with you we find freedom over the ocean and on the winds. And we claim this freedom and this liberation from the wind of breath, the wind of Ruah, the wind that has breathed the breath of life into us. We inhale your wisdom and your honor and pour this libation to you. Good evening, friends. This slide that you see before you, this image that you see before you is called Stars and Stripes. It is a piece of art by an artist named Michael Anthony Brown, actually. And I was at a flea market / rodeo in West Jersey, right by the Delaware Memorial Bridge with my coworkers, and we took a self-care day and went to this flea market. And I said, I'm not gonna buy anything, I'm not gonna buy anything. And yet there was this image framed, laying on the side of a white van on the grass. And as the rainstorms came in over the rodeo grounds, the woman said, I don't want to take this back to New York. I'm willing to sell this for $100. As I looked even closer at the image, I realized that it was the second print out of 400 and that it was signed by the artist. It said to Larry, the struggle continues, Michael Anthony Brown. But when you look very closely upon this image, you will see that on the right shoulder, where it is reddened, that this is named Stars and Stripes because the image of the American flag is bore on his back. And the writing on the back says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and then it fades away. Because this image represents a promise yet unfulfilled. And yet I understand this to have a much more universal meaning for all of us. The pain and the scars of the stars and stripes that this man bears upon his back. We all bear these scars until the aspirations of the founders are realized in their divine inspiration in that particular moment, whether they knew or rose above their humanity, who knew or who knows. But what we do know is that they wrote down these words for us to try our best to make real. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed, and all the rest of those words. And until we realize that, we are being scarred with our stars and our stripes to push us onward. And we have to bear them strongly, as this gentleman is bearing his. Strongly and proudly, with the manacle of the chain broken, as you can see. And the difference between the last image and this image is that in this image, his back is not bowed. His back is straight and firm and sees the promise of what can be. This image I share with you to say that freedom is not romantic, but it can boldly claim what is right, what is righteous, and what is good. Next slide, please. Tonight we have called and honored the ancestors, and we have done a libation. We spoke through the silent to the silent in the language of the rhythms, voices, the affinity of that through song. We intoned, "Oh freedom." We struck the drum to figure out exactly what it is in this rhythm that speaks in our hearts, that trips us up, that makes us feel the emergent necessity of liberation. Moving forward, we will be learning together. We will learn about the Emancipation / General Order number 3. We'll talk about Black Lives Matter. What does that really mean? And then we'll work together on the work to be done. And an idea that I want to talk to you about cohorts meeting and then coming back together. So this is what we have in store for ourselves this evening. So I hope you will enjoy and think with me and learn with me and not just from me. Let's move to the next slide. In front of you, you see the Emancipation Proclamation from 1863. It's a part of it. It's in 2 pieces. There's Emancipation number 93 and Emancipation number 95, a Proclamation number 95 that was written 10 days later, and that became more of the finalized version. This is the romantic notion of what we remember. That on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, that those people who hold them shall then be in rebellion against the United States. And then that's forward under the executive government of the United States in order that there will be military action for defying that. This order was to free all of the slaves that were being held in the South. And this great romantic notion that this Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 was such a glorious event actually did nothing for the slaves in the South. Because of the secession, we actually understand that all of the slaves who were being held against their will and against the will of the Northern government stayed in servitude, stayed in slavery. In fact, we know that sometimes the slavery became even more cruel. We do know that it opened up the way for slaves to be free as they came north, but even that wasn't a guarantee that they wouldn't be brought back south. The Emancipation Proclamation was more of a directed order to be able to declare war than it was, in truth, freeing the slaves. Next slide, please. This is an important thing to understand, that the idea of being able to justify war was sort of submuted underneath this larger romantic notion that we are going to free all of the slaves because we have the high moral ground. When in actuality, everyone really, really, really knew what was really going to happen. That the South would secede, that West Virginia would have about 53 counties that would become West Virginia out of Virginia, and that they would stay with the North. And that this Emancipation Proclamation really was ineffectual in a way for the lives of those for whom it was supposed to help, whom it was supposed to heal. And I give you these two snippets of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, because even though it claims and says that everyone is free, everyone is equal, it put nothing in place to ensure that that equality and that freedom would be 100%, or that it would even work towards making freedom and equality a reality. I bring you this notion specifically about the Emancipation Proclamation being just that, a proclamation, because there is a difference between a proclamation and a statement and an action statement that lists goals and ideas and dreams and achievements to make that goal realized. And the Emancipation Proclamation did none of that. So if we want to pull out the slides and stop sharing the screen for a while, I'll speak to you for just a little bit about some of my thoughts on this. This Emancipation Proclamation, we celebrate it, and I do say that we celebrate it rightly so. We do celebrate it rightly so. But it is our duty to be educated about the true politics of it. And it is our duty to be educated about why Juneteenth, as a follow-up for this Emancipation Proclamation, is so heralded. When I think about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think about Juneteenth, and I think about the Civil Rights Movement, and I think about Black Lives Matter, and I think about the deaths that we see happening underneath the veil of police protection, when I see our Black trans men and women being killed at high numbers and just forgotten and swept under the rug, when I see the microaggressions and the many ways that many of the systemic issues that we're trying so desperately to right, when I see the last vestiges of them clinging so firmly, like a root of a weed into the ground, I look back and I say, well, what image can I think of that makes me have an ability to try and understand and have faith that this still can go out? And then I realized that my training is in homiletics, the art of preaching, and also in New Testament. New Testament, the Greek and Hebrew texts sort of fused together to talk about this new movement of the way, not Christianity, the way. A new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding identity, understanding purpose in an empire, understanding that you are worth something, that your value is worth something while you're underneath the oppression of an empire. That this understanding was the only understanding that was really given to Black slaves once they were free and once they were given the opportunity, even in slavery, to have a little bit of religion. Because Paul always says, slaves obey your master, but it's not really Paul. It's Paul talking about this system of order of the household codes, that much of the New Testament way of talking about family and family structure is built upon this Roman household of codes. Slaves, obey your masters. Women, obey your husbands. Husbands, be dutiful to your wives. It's an equal proposition, by the way. But in this notion of the New Testament, part of the reason why slaves were taught the New Testament only is because there is liberation from oppression in the Old Testament. Harriet Tubman was named Moses for a reason. She was named Moses because there was here tell of stories in this Bible that our masters had that told the story of this man named Moses who went back for his people, who went back into this oppressive system, and who went back to his people and said, I am going to bring you out into freedom. And just like Harriet's experience, people were incredulous. They wouldn't go back. They wanted to stay where they were because they were afraid of dying. They were afraid of what was on the other side. And also because they knew that, like Pharaoh, their hearts had been hardened. Their masters' hearts were hardened. You tried to run away, your foot was chopped off. If you tried to take your children with you, you were sold away from your children, or vice versa. But this whole notion of Pharaoh's heart being hardened, this is something I'm taking up now as an African-American scholar, because I really do believe that we have spoken to liberation and freedom for African-Americans and persons of color for almost a couple of 100 years now. At least been talking about it before it even happened in 1863. But every single time a grand gesture and a grand notion has been made, it seems as if Pharaoh, or our system, which is Pharaoh for this conversation, our system's heart is hardened. And the persons of color and persons who are oppressed are thrown back into that oppression. It's quickly forgotten the plagues that have been set upon the land of America. And I draw this analogy because I wonder how many plagues is it going to take? We are in a pandemic. And I'm not saying that this is the curse or the work of God. But what I am saying is that when we are faced with our own mortality, we end up seeing the value of life. And can we use this to see the value of all life mattering? Can we use this to really say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal? Can we take this opportunity of this pandemic and use it as a cure for our endemic of racism and othering and isms in our communities? The biggest fear with our pandemic of COVID-19 is not that it cannot find a vaccine, or not that it won't be cured, and not that we've even lost so many people. We've lost 100,000 people. But it's the fear that we will have to label it an endemic, which means that it is something that we can't control, that will come back time and time again to revisit its power on us in such a negative way. That is the largest medical fear, is that this pandemic will become an endemic. And I use that parallel because it's here now in our reality to look at race relations. Here on the eve of Juneteenth, the pandemic of racism was not inoculated with the vaccine of the Emancipation Proclamation. No. It was simply classified and labeled by those who were in control that this is going to be an endemic that we will just simply try to manage. The color of my skin and the values I hold in my life is an American endemic for systems. I am a virus in systems. I come back time and time again, trying to be free, trying to heal, trying to cure, and every time something happens in our culture and in our history that throws us back into the arms of this endemic that we refuse to put the work in to find a cure for. Perhaps Juneteenth is the opportunity for us to recognize that there is a cure. And it's when liberation is claimed by all, for all. The Emancipation Proclamation was freedom claimed for those who could not have it, for those we had no power to say that we are giving you freedom. Pure and simple. But we do have the power now to understand liberation and our joy in liberation. We call it these words that make us feel uncomfortable. We call it privilege. We call it fragility. We call it patriarchy. But really the vestiges of what we are claiming as liberation, if we take it out of these human terms of father and color and all of that and say, well, what is liberation really? What is freedom really other than rightness? And if we as people are calling for rightness, rightness, not even righteousness, but rightness, then we are understanding the power of freedom, boldly claiming what is right in this world. And when we are in what is right in this world, we have the opportunity to be in relationship like many of us are. Sharing meals, sharing rituals, sharing opportunities to talk about past, to grieve together, to pray Kaddish together. We have an opportunity to relish in the pains and the joys of one another and understand that in community of liberation, we are never alone. It is an ideal, but it is what this emancipation stuff is really all about. So in 1863, January 1st, all slaves were freed. But it wasn't until April 9th, 1965, at the end of the Civil War, where that became the reality of this country. Except word traveled slow. Word traveled very slowly. And there were slaves who were hearing of freedom, knowing that they were free. But as I said before, what had been laid out in place to make freedom really accessible? Having a stamp of being free does not make you free. What does freedom open you up for, to give you access to? And who and what is putting the parameters around your quote unquote limits of freedom so that emancipation is not liberation? Well, in 1865, it became the Freedmen's Bureau down south. It became the antebellum South. It became the South where people were lynched and where the KKK found its new power and purpose. It became a way of stringing people up in trees on a Sunday afternoon and inviting everyone to come out after church while you had a picnic tree. This is how we go backwards. How do we move forward in this quest for liberation? Next slide, please. This is the announcement that was made on June 19th, 1865. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the government of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property. Former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that of employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages, and are informed that they will not be allowed to collect military posts, and they will not be supported. The Emancipation Proclamation and this General Order number 3 were miles apart from one another, just as they were months away from one another. After the failed way of watching freedom happen in the South, they put this little caveat in here to make sure that we want you to stay where you are. We want you to get paid for your hire and just wait a while we figure that out. But yet we still celebrate this, and it was a quiet celebration for many, many, many years. And people wondered, why are Black people celebrating Juneteenth? What is that all about? But now that it's coinciding and converging with all of these instances, we have to find a common way to claim this notion of liberation and freedom. And I offer this as a way to do so, as Black and whites together, and persons of color, all people together. Not just jumping in on understanding and saying, I get Juneteenth and I'm in solidarity with it. That is inalienable. Are we willing to claim and lift up and say it must be enacted because it has already been declared? To me, that is what Juneteenth is. Juneteenth is an opportunity for us to declare the liberation, the freedom, the rightness of all human beings in a moment when we seem to have forgotten. It is a time when we collectively turn to Pharaoh, our systems, and say, soften your heart and let our people go. This is that moment. We're converging on pandemic, endemic, protest, Black Lives Matter, people being murdered by police, people being murdered by people and vigilantes in the street while they're out on a job, people being murdered by police in their own homes. This is the moment where we see how hard our hearts have been. And it is the moment when we recognize that as hard as our hearts are, we can say, go, be free. Go, be free. Because in your freedom, I find my freedom. In your liberation, I finally understand the extent of my liberation. When we are free together, we are all free together. That's when this notion of liberation and emancipation really takes flight on the wings of an eagle that we claim as our bird, as our national symbol of flying majestically through the air. One of the things I love about an eagle, and this is what we have the opportunity to do with one another. Did you know that a mother eagle plants her nest about 300 feet up, and when the eaglets hatch, they suck from the mother and they do what the mother does and what she needs to do to raise them. And then when the time is right, the mother will push them out of the nest. And the baby will go falling and dropping and freaking out and screeching until they stretch out their wings and flap and flap and flap. And then they start to fly. And they realize that mama pushed me out so that I could do this. And then their arms get tired and their wings get tired. And they start to slowly stop moving their wings, and they fall, and they start to plummet, and they head towards the earth again, and the mother eagle comes and swoops in and takes them back to the nest to rest. That's the first lesson of flying and being free. Going out into the unknown, knowing that you have the power to move forward. And when your energy fails, that we're there to lift one another up. That's how we learn how to fly in freedom together. That's liberation. That's emancipation. So as we celebrate Juneteenth, and celebrate the day that these last slaves heard that they no longer had to figure out how to run away. They no longer had to figure out how to hide, but that they could say for a moment, I am free. It is this moment of Juneteenth that is celebrated. It is the elation of the ancestors that wells up in my spirit and in my body on June 19th when I wake up. Whether the sun rises or the rain falls matters not to me. What matters is that there was a moment in time where the descendants of those who were shoved into ships, who held hope and who held the hopes of freedom, the ancestors celebrated with them, being brought in from the east, the west, the north, and the south. and they celebrated in that moment of Juneteenth. Freedom and liberation. And the reason why we keep fighting over and over through obstacle after obstacle, death after death, with Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth, is because we know that this moment of freedom is real. And we will claim that realness until it is made so. My friends, that's the beauty of Juneteenth. A community, no matter how oppressed you are, has a moment in time to say, this is what it felt like, and this is what will spur me on. Next slide, please. I lifted up from the Black Lives Matter website about us. And this is what I am calling, for this part of our conversation, the legacy of liberation. We see people in the street saying, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And then we see the videos of the anti-protesters saying, well, all lives matter. Well, I just want us to be very clear that the Black Lives Matter movement never said that all lives didn't matter. If you look at what is highlighted in the yellow, this is part of their statement of being, part of our statement of being. We work vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. We intentionally build and nurture a beloved community that is bonded together through a beautiful strength that is restorative, not depleting. Unapologetically Black in our positioning and affirming Black Lives Matter. And we don't need to qualify that position. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a prerequisite for this. Part of our work is to know this. We can chant Black Lives Matter, and I understand Black Lives Matter, and we can do it in our protests, but in our conversations, this is what we lift up. Because if Black Lives Matter, then by extension, we are saying all lives matter. But it is nothing to fear to claim that Black Lives Matter. That is a power of this moment and the permission that we have to claim unapologetically that Black Lives Matter. Next slide. And this is just more from that about us on their website. I encourage you to go to that, blacklivesmatter.com. And next slide. And next slide. Now, if all lives matter, we will speak for what is really absent in the all, which is why we say Black Lives Matter. It's easy to overlook these items of freedom and liberation. Can we make a commitment to say we will see? We have work to do. But it's important to understand that we will do our own work and then bring it to the collective table. So just as Black Lives Matter separated and as a cohort to define this for themselves and for ourselves, so white people need to do, so Asians need to do, so Italians need to do, so Polish need to do, so people of Jewish heritage need to do. And then when we come together, we don't have to revisit the trauma of one another all over again, but we can start from a place of saying, let's bring what the work we've done is to this table and claim now how we all matter. If we take out all lives, all in lives matter, then we can actually begin to see who's really at. So I encourage us in our time that we have remaining to think about how will we figure out how to speak for the absent in all? How will we see the absent when people want us to say all lives matter? Who's absent in that? And what work do we have to do in our own cohorts to stand firm in our regiments and then say Black Lives Matter? And we are saying that in solidarity because we've come to our understanding as to why it's important for us to stand in solidarity. Brother Amichai, I want you to look at this particular slide, and I would like for you to speak out these words, and then breathe for a moment, and then tell me what thoughts come to your mind.
If all lives matter, we will speak for the absent in all, easy to overlook. We will see. We have work to do. We will do our own work and bring it to the table. The word we, Brother Derrick, has a whole new meaning these days and on this night. And I'm so grateful is not sufficient a word. To your instruction and invitation to truly reckon with what the word we can and should mean. That's just an initial heart response.
Thank you. My computer is some distance away from me, so I can't open up the chat. But I don't know if you have any thoughts as a body that you would like to throw forward for discussion or put in the chat to be read, or any thoughts that you would like to share as we're still in this in-between space, waiting for Juneteenth to occur. That moment where we're waiting, anticipating that somebody's coming by tomorrow to tell us something's supposed to be important.
So Derrick, I'm seeing that a few comments are in the box. Is it okay if I read them for you?
Yes.
And yeah, I want to encourage folks to, we'll take the next 10 minutes or 15 or so to your comments and questions. And if you feel like you want to unmute and speak, I'm not sure you can unmute yourselves. We'll find out in a moment. Lewis writes, General Order Number 3 reminded of the frustration of reform as a half step.
That's good. Those half steps that get mediated once they come into a larger group, sometimes it's very interesting. As we watch what's happening with our current government analysis, with, even with aid to those who need it for funding during COVID, and even with the arguing over the civil rights and arguing over voters' rights and how things get watered down. Yeah, it's the half steps that are deemed acceptable.
I'll read you more of the comments, Derrick. And I want to invite everybody to breathe, hold our hearts, listen well, think of this precious opportunity to engage in conversation. And I would like to ask you in a moment, Derrick, when I read these comments, you mentioned before about, you started talking about your thought of these cohorts, of the work we'll be doing to bring to the table. I'd love to hear you think more about that, if you would. Oh, invite us more, but let me please go ahead.
No, I've been sort of thinking about that all day. It's, I get this idea from a cohort that I was invited to be a part of for a fellowship. And once we got together, we realized that we were doing such hard work individually in this particular fellowship that all of our disparate diversity groups were revisiting our trauma and presenting it presenting it almost in a voyeuristic way. And so what we decided that we charged our leaders to do is say, we need our own space with our own people to deal with this trauma, so that we are in trauma with people that know our trauma, so that we don't have to explain it while we're going through it, so that we can have a common voice to bring to the table about how we're dealing with this and how we want to deal with this as a group now. For example, when I think of the gentleman who we're debating over whether or not he committed suicide in Fort Tyrone Park, and it's just so hard to figure and fathom an African-American man lynching himself in a tree in a park. Trying to figure out what trauma that brings up for me, and talking about it in an open space is something that is very difficult unless I can deal with it with persons of color whose ancestors have seen that as well, so that I can have an opportunity to say, I can't fathom this, I can get angry about it, I can get mad about it, I can cry about it, without saying that I have to do that in front of the entire world at the table. I can do it in my cohort, and we can figure out the language that we need to describe it once we're at the table. Our cohorts help us to find a common language with which we can bring our issues to the table, so that we don't have to continually worry about having to define what it is that we're going through to the other groups that are diverse around us, because that pricks at our vulnerability. when we feel that we're under a microscope having to explain not only how we feel, but why it matters. So if we can figure out how it feels in our cohorts and then come together to the table with the language of like why it matters, it's a little bit more of an objective way of categorizing what it is that what we're feeling. And I bring that experience from working with adjudicated youth in a playwriting program. I was talking about this just the other day. There was a juvenile defender program, several of them. And these kids who were in juvenile detention facilities for murder, for rape, for horrible, horrible, horrible things, were given the opportunity to write a play about it and to see that play performed. And once they were able to see it up on stage and in front of them, they were able to recognize the trauma in which their lives had formed this way of being for themselves. And every young person that we worked with, over 100 people over about 3.5 years, none of them became recidivists in the juvenile justice system or in the criminal system. Because they had an opportunity to delve into it and then to see it and say, oh, okay, now that I can see it objectively and I can hear people talking about it objectively, I've dealt with the trauma in writing it. And that's the experience that I bring to this cohort group is we can experience it and then find the language to bring it to the table together. If that makes sense. We can make our own pie with our own ingredients and just say, we brought a blueberry pie, we brought an apple pie. And the secret ingredient remains the same, remains secret.
Like a potluck of peace.
Yes.
You know what you were speaking about the table, about the work we need to do in our cohorts, in our, the word safe is tricky here, but in the place of vulnerability and honesty so we can come to the table together. The verse that came to me was from Psalm 23. With its tricky translation where it says, the Hebrew says, Ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged tzorerai dishanta b'shemen roshi kosi revaya. The English, you spread a table before me in full view of my enemies. That's one of the translations. But the word tzorerai, it could be my enemies or my foe, but it could be those that I am gathered with.
Yes.
Right, there's a table spread where we are, right? Your Zoom is only signifying how you're at your table and I'm at mine, but really we're looking at each other and it's not about foes, it's about different. And we're all gathered together and then our heads are anointed and our cup is full of blessing.
Yes. Yes.
It's a vision for the tables we will share once we do the work.
Yes.
And I speak for me, I speak for. Let me give you a moment to breathe. I'm going to read a few of the comments that have come in that are really echoing this. Thank you so much again. Jared is writing, then and now, all lives, all men, not have implicit dehumanizations. Both have implicit dehumanizations. Ilana writes, I am wholly committed to do my share in this movement. I felt motivated by anger, born of injustice, but your talk, Father Derrick, also welcomed me to be energized and commit and love.
It was supposed to say energized by community and love.
It works beautifully, Ilana. Thank you for
Rabbi.
all those intentions. Thank you. And Renee writes, we have our own work to do is a very powerful statement. Each group must find its own way, as does each individual, towards the larger goal, our shared table. Roxanne writes, the other night, our partners discussed ways of doing our own work to become more right. Does Reverend Derrick have any suggestions to guide us in our work? So I'll read Paul's comment and then ask you if you got any suggestion. And then maybe after that, we all take a breath and think of how you want to pause for this of many conversations, I hope. I'll just read Paul's comment. Every time laws are passed, i.e. Constitution, Emancipation Proclamation 13 and 14th Amendment, Civil Rights Act, it seems the southern states skew or twist the approach to deprave Americans of C and benefit
Americans of color.
Americans of color, thank you, and benefit their white citizens. The racism virus mutates to prevent vaccines goal.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So a few of the many comments that are obviously in our minds and in our hearts tonight. I wonder if you might, if you want to say something to what Roxanne is asking about guidance in our work to do and our questions and guidance. And I do hope we will work together in so many ways as we have. But anything?
One thing that I find is I've been doing a lot of work over the past couple of weeks with many of the boards that I find myself, that the cosmos has placed me in several places and several boards now where for such a time as this, I'm placed here in this moment and this work. And it's been very interesting how the universe has played with me that way. But I'm grateful. But the idea of addressing the truth, and the truth, of course, will be relative, but in answering what the truth is for the moment and not being afraid to say, well, that truth is not going to last for now, but it's going to start us in this process of conversation around and in dialogue in this. This notion of how do we break through, we start by grabbing at what the universe throws at us. And I say that what the universe is throwing at us now is our fragility and our vulnerability. And in a conversation I had earlier this afternoon with a friend of mine in Kansas City, I said that it is in our vulnerabilities, when we both recognize when we all recognize our vulnerabilities, that's when we find where we can connect and are strong. But we have to be vulnerable. I'm working with many organizations that are alienated from the term white fragility. No one wants to claim that, and no one wants to talk about how painful that thought is and how alienating that thought and that conversation is. But having the conversation about the alienation and the pain of it is really important. Because until you address it and deal with the pain and deal with the anger and the hurt of some of these terms that are being thrown about, and really throwing them out and saying, okay, well, how do I feel about these? How do we feel about them? You can get all of that other stuff out and say, now how are we going to process them together as we do our work? Specifically when I speak about white fragility, there are many wealthy people and wealthy communities that are saying, well, you know, I've always been for this, but my intention hasn't followed through all the way throughout. And I don't know what to do. And well, maybe if we just get more people of color here, more people of color there. And it's like, no, you have to do the hard work. And the hard work is saying, okay, I messed up. We messed up. But we are human beings. And we are human beings that when we err, we look for solutions to do better. And that's all that fragility is. And there's a beautiful, beautiful Japanese art that when you break a ceramic bowl, you put it back together by melting silver or gold, and you fuse it back together, and the broken pieces becomes this even more beautiful piece of art that is useful in the home again, but it's still very beautiful. And I love that idea that we're okay to be broken, because what we fill in our cracks with makes us even more beautiful. So the hard work in those areas is being truthful about even being angry and pissed off that somebody thinks that you're racist, and exploring what that means and exploring why would someone think that? Why would someone see that? And then saying, well, I'm not, but now I have a whole other understanding of why people think other people are racist. Even if that's something that you can't hold, we don't have to. We can easily then at least identify with, oh, these are the microaggressions that someone is talking about. This is what they mean. For example, there was a letter written today about an incident that happened at a park in Harlem from an African-American woman pastor of a Presbyterian church. And executives of the Presbytery decided her letter as well. And they just affixed their name to her letter, her words, her pain of her community. They affixed their name because they felt that it was the privilege and right thing for them to do in a leadership role without even asking. That's a microaggression that has an African-American woman pastor who's new in her pastorate, caring for her community, dealing with this incident that it's the first time she's ever dealing with anything like this. All of a sudden, she's being co-signed for her community by the two elder white statespersons of the Presbytery. And I have to call it out because it diminishes her voice as a leader in her African-American community. So and when I call that out with these gentlemen, we will have the discussion, and because I've done it before, they'll get it and they'll talk about it, and we'll just have to wait for the next time to call it out again. But then at least I now have a pattern where I can call things out, whereas 2 years ago I didn't. That make sense?
There are a lot of ways to get the Pharaoh's heart, our hearts, to, I'm going to say to soften, to unharden, but from moving to a hard heart to an open heart, there's a lot of work to do.
And when we're speaking of midrashic texts, when I did my master's thesis at Union Theological Seminary, I did it on Esau and Jacob and a comparison between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. That was the thesis, right? And it all stemmed because Malcolm X was called red and Esau had the red mantle. So go figure, creativity, right? But one of the things, the midrashic text that I really looked at to speak towards that relationship was the reunion of Jacob and Esau, and that they were so overcome with emotion being back in one another's presence that they ran across the plain to one another. But as they were running back across the plain, all the emotions from the anger and the hatred and the animosity came right back. And as Esau came up to Jacob, he went to go and bite him on his neck. And God turned his neck to stone. And Esau broke his jaw on his brother's neck and had to embrace him and fall into him instead. And that Midrash was saying, and so this is where we have the notion that we are a stiff-necked people. So I enjoyed that because it gave me this wonderful notion of the action of the divine to protect us from ourselves and to embolden us for ourselves. And I'm still struggling, and I will be struggling for another year or two with how in the world do we justify that this heart was hardened. And in the language of much of the text I've been reading, that the free will was taken away from Pharaoh to allow for this to happen. But what is on the other side of that? what is on the other side of our hearts not being hardened, but what is on the other side of those who are being liberated to embrace this new liberation?
Yeah. I think like the story that you are teaching us tonight, Derrick, the story of Passover, as you know, as we've done Passover and Easter and Pentecost and so many holidays together. In the Jewish tradition, Passover is a night of questions. It is not a night of answers.
Right?
So this too, through your multi-level of heart, mind, information, and charge, Juneteenth, I think for so many of us with you tonight, become a day of questions, a day of resolve. For me, a day of commitment to follow your charge.
And just a side note, when you hear African Americans talking about on New Year's Eve of a watch night service,
Yeah.
that watch night service is a religious service where on New Year's Eve, you are on your knees praying, or you're in church, or you're doing something supposedly holy. But it's really meant to bring back that moment of December 31st, 1863, where the slaves were waiting for 12 o'clock to happen for the Emancipation Proclamation to drop. So that watch night service and that idea of watch night and watching for liberation and emancipation is very much like the Passover night.
The midnight.
And then very much even in terms of like, well, now we're free, but now how do we all be free? And we need to leave from Pharaoh in order to be free and to explore what this freedom means for us. So this Juneteenth is an extension of this watch night that was celebrated 2 years earlier, 2.5 years earlier, December 31st, 1862. So.
Derrick, I know that I could sit and learn with you and from you for many, many, many more hours, and I'm sure I'm not alone. However,
Yes.
we've had a long day. Tomorrow is a very important and packed day, and I'm sure for all of us, there's some processing to be had tonight and some breathing and listening and further prayers. So I want to invite you to think how we take the next couple of moments as you so ritually started us, calling our ancestors in the directions, being in prayer. If there's a word or sound of prayer or intention you want to end with, if I say a couple words and we call it a night.
I just simply want to thank you for this opportunity to be in conversation with you, my family, my Lab Shul family, and others. And basically, I just really understand the power of these words even more in this gathering on this night. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more moaning, no more moaning, no go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And go home to my Lord and be free.
Ashe. Amen. You sounded good in that church, brother. I'm sorry it's just you in there, but it's an honor to be there with you,
Thank you, my brother.
all of us, in your sacred space and in your large, large heart.
Thank you all.
Deep gratitude, Derrick. I know that I speak for my community, for our Lab Shul family, that this is a conversation that is continuing with increased attention. What you gave us tonight was a charge. You are a grown-up in charge and a teacher of soul and truth. And I deeply, deeply thank you for taking the time with us tonight.
Thank you.
And I send love and appreciation to all of us who are still on, whether you're with us on Zoom or on Facebook. I want to invite our community to join us tomorrow during Juneteenth at 3 p.m. for our daily Soul Spa, where we will meditate and sing and recite a special version of the Mourners Peace Prayer with an intention that was handed to us generously by our friends in the Jewish Multiracial Network, who created the special invocation for the Kaddish for Juneteenth 2020. We'll be reciting it tomorrow at Soul Spa and on Saturday at Soul Spa. So our sacred time continues. May this be a night of peace, and may these be days of justice, dignity, and love. Derrick, good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tia, for helping us moderate.
See ya.
Thank you all.